I'm going to be doing my speech on the film Lee. So, history has often had the tendency to overlook great women. For Lee Miller, the case was no different. For decades after her death, her work as a model and muse to legendary visual artist Man Ray overshadowed her groundbreaking work as a photographer on the front lines of World War II. Now, thanks to the film Lee, she's finally getting the recognition she deserves. Today, I'm going to attempt to persuade you to watch the 2023 film Lee, directed by Ellen Kuras, because it tells the powerful and inspiring story of American photographer Lee Miller. This film is particularly inspiring because it highlights how one woman was able to give a rare insight into the atrocities of World War II when people either had no idea the full extent of the horrors at hand or believed that it was just too evil to be true. To this day, her work remains one of the most important photo documentations and evidence of the war. First, I'm going to be going through a brief overview of the film and explain the main points. Next, I'm going to explain the significance of these points, and then lastly, I'm going to be discussing some critical reviews, both positive and negative, and then I'm going to be giving my response to them. The film begins with a flashback. Immediately, we're transported into the heart of the war, and then completely it shifts gears, and then we're transported into 1977. At this point, Lee is now 77 years old, and she's being interviewed by a young journalist about her work. This establishes a back and forth between the past and present and reflects on the long-term psychological weight that the war had on Lee. As the film progresses, it follows the events that took place between 1932 and 1945. She meets and falls in love with Roland Penrose, and then they end up moving to London, where she's able to get a job at Vogue as a photographer documenting the aftermath of the Blitz. It isn't until the war in 1941, when the U.S. finally enters the war, that she becomes a correspondent alongside a fellow photographer by the name of David Sherman. Throughout her time as a war correspondent, she's constantly faced with gender bias, and rather than allowing this to deter her from her mission or dictate how she approaches her work, she remains completely focused and does not let it interfere with her process. As the film progresses, the emotional trauma that she experiences becomes ever present, and it reveals the lasting psychological trauma, and it kind of creates like a interesting character arc and shows like really interesting character development. Now I'm going to be talking about why it's worth watching. One of the strongest aspects of this film is the amazing performance by Kate Winslet. She's able to capture the many dimensions of Lee Miller, and she's able to show her as a flawed but authentic person. And by doing this, she's able to get a real grasp of the character, and she's able to connect the character to the audience and kind of making her somebody that people can relate to. Another aspect that makes the film stand out is the fact that it's told through the lens of a woman. As stated before, the film takes place between 1932 and 1945, and as a result, it creates a unique perspective on war and overall the female experience that's usually overlooked in film or in history in general. And I think that many women can appreciate that because that's something that is just really underrepresented, and so it's really interesting to see a different perspective. Finally, another thing that makes this film really interesting is the visual element. I feel like for a film to be really interesting, it has to be visually captivating, and the cinematography in this film gives a really great insight to the capturing of these beautiful photographs in a way that feels natural but also like unfiltered. This allows the audience to be carried away through the visual storytelling, but also reminds them that this isn't just a story, but actually like a retelling of history. Now I'm going to be talking about critical reviews. There was an article posted by Variety on October 30th of 1923 that says that the film was able to capture how Lee Miller transformed into a, quote, fearless photographer while capturing the horrors of the war. I agree with this statement because the film was really able to highlight how Lee was often placing herself in life or death situation, regardless of her personal well-being, but for the sake of documenting what was actually going on at the time when nobody else was doing that. In contrast, there was another article posted by The Hollywood Reporter on September 10th of 2023 that juxtaposes this view completely, saying that the film never fully penetrated the enigma of its subject. And while I can appreciate this point of view, I disagree because I think that the film effectively, focused on the emotional and mental toll that the war placed on Lee rather than being like a biographical film. I think those are two different purposes. In closing, I think the 2023 film Lee, directed by Ellen Kuras, starring Kate Winslet, should be a film that everybody watches at least once. It serves as a social rebirth or rediscovery for Lee Miller, the war correspondent, the legendary photographer, and now she's finally getting the recognition she deserves as well as the flowers she deserves.